Hi, my name is Ratchat and I am the owner and producer of Magistry Studios, and today I thought we'd take a moment to talk about some of the tabletop games with the most unique mechanics. One of the things that a lot of people talk about when they're getting started in trying to do some sort of game writing or make a really good module is they'll look at D&D or some established system and start making a module for that. And while that does make for a good game and is a fantastic way to get started as a writer, there's a whole bunch of other games out there that do strange and unusual stuff to quite effective game design. So we're going to take a moment tonight to just go through and talk about those things and some of my favorite games to play. The first game is Dread, brought to you by Epi Ravicol and Nathaniel Barmore. The two of them went together and designed a game using the Jenga system. You're just playing a game of Jenga, every single time you would do something life-threatening in a horror game. And one of the things that becomes really effective about this design is it's really easy to pick up and play. Most people already know how to play Jenga. And then from there, you do a loose character outline and get thrown into a slasher film. It's really interesting where anything that a character would naturally be able to do, such as pull a knife, they're capable of doing, but using said knife, now that's a little higher stakes. Gotta pull a Jenga tower in order to see if it happens. Tower falls, you die. And that doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing, because in horror, death isn't the worst outcome. So there's lots of really great stories coming out of Dread where people are staring at the table, thinking about the connections and relationships they've developed over the course of the game, and they're looking at the tower. It is incredibly unstable. And they realize the only way for everybody else to get out is for them to reset the tower. So they'll do something wild and dramatic, stand up, and simply push over the tower in order to force a reset. Their character dies, however, the tower is now reset, and everybody else is on a much better playing field with a much higher probability of getting out. Further from here, then there was Alex Roberts, who took the base idea of the Jenga tower from Dread and turned it into a romance and added some really interesting additional mechanics. Starcrossed, her game, is a two-player lovers who should never be lovers, a romance that should never be but is too tempting to avoid. The Romeo and Juliets, the Romeo x Juliets. There's been a lot of variations of that story over the years. And Alex Roberts went through and said the major inspiration of the give and take of a love story reflects a partner dance. And so those are your two character sheets, the lead and the follow, the person who is doing the pursuing action and the person who is responding to that leading action. And in doing so, you end up having a give and take between the two and really dramatic moments when the other person acts in your style with much more limited constraints than they would do naturally. And in that case, the tower falls over, and you fall in love with each other, and it is too tempting to resist. It's really quite a stellar game. Won the Diana Jones Awards for how well it was designed. And I highly recommend taking a look at both of these games in order to both look at how to use tension in a game by increasing the sense of dread, but also how horror and romance actually have a lot of very similar emotional beats in their design. Next, we're getting into Feast, which is one of my favorite games from Sharang Biswas. Sharang Biswas is a bit of an experimental designer who is known for doing slightly unhinged games, and Feast is inspired by a dinner party. How it's designed is you have 5 different flavor profiles that are all attributed to different memories, and you are playing a parasite, alien parasite, eating at the memories of whoever your host is. And as you experience those memories, they get lost forever. So as the parasite eats, you also eat through your dinner and tell the story together at the table, one by one, as you go through the different meals and the way one would eat the meal. It's a very simple design, and when I played it for the first time, it was as an art installation in Philadelphia, where we were using just little odds and ends treats, some really dark chocolate, some salty pretzels, some sort of gummy candy in order to be sweet. And from there, even with just very simple food, whatever you could pretty much get at the grocery store right off the shelf or a corner store, we were able to go through and create quite elaborate characters, most of them pretty tragic, as we were eating through their memories. It was really quite fun. Next, we're getting into Fall of Magic by Ross Cowan, which the year it came out, it was impossible to keep on the shelves even as a $100 game. And we're not even saying in this modern economy, this was a good 2018, 2019, could not stay on the shelf for a $100 game. And that was because it came with a scroll that you unfurled little by little as you explored the world. So as your characters were exploring the world, you two as a player were actively exploring and finding parts of the world you did not know existed previously. It ends up following the stories of a bunch of these travelers going on a little bit of a pilgrimage as magic is starting to fade from the world. And in doing so, they're trying to reconnect with culture, find things to reconnect with in the world, find community within themselves as a pilgrimage party, and eventually get to the City of Magic. Just absolutely stunning, beautiful game. And having the physical mechanic of unrolling the scroll as you go, as it takes over the entire table, showing you in real time the story you have created. Really slick mechanic. So we get to The Quiet Year by Avery Alder. I'll be honest, the first time I played this game, I thought it was an incomplete game because I did not fully understand the type of story that it was trying to tell. I insisted that this was a great session 0, but let's tell the rest of the story, when what Avery was trying to focus on was the relationship of a civilization when they're in between two tense moments, and rumblings beneath the surface are starting to build up, but haven't reached their head yet, and that is the mechanic of contempt. I didn't understand this mechanic in the first place because it has next to no mechanical anything. Just so happens that as the world is building up and people are making decisions, you have discussions as a group, little murmurings between the community. If there's something that you're like, no, this isn't quite right, you take a contempt. And it just slowly builds up and builds up. And through that, it has become a very effective educational tool in a lot of colleges, especially teaching people with a privileged background what it's like to not have a place to put their voice. It starts opening up a bunch of communications and lots of stories and general learning opportunities for these populations that previously didn't have a means to connect to this idea that sometimes you have civilization making decisions for you and you don't like it and it doesn't benefit you and it isn't in any of your regards and it's happening anyway. And so as a result, I think of this game as one of the most powerful games despite how simple the story is. I highly recommend it. Getting into one of my favorite party games is Murderous Ghosts by Meg and Vincent Baker. The idea is that you are a person who ended up in a house full of murderous ghosts. Kind of what it says on the tin. Designed as a 2-player game, it has been adapted into an audience participation mass voting game, and honestly, I much prefer it in that style because making good decisions is not really always in your interest. You might survive if you make better decisions, but that's not necessarily more entertaining or more fun when you can see the various different ways that ghosts could murder you, meet different ghosts, things like that. One of the game's mechanics that I think is the most interesting is the fact that they focus on a blackjack-like system where you're trying to get enough of a success in order to actually keep plowing forward without going over a certain number and immediately dying. So as a result, you end up having this balancing act of pressing your luck, considering what's in the deck, because your goal is to collect aces, and if you have enough aces of enough different suits, you get out. But at the same time, you're adding and adding and pushing to the limit before you remove everything and set up for an automatic loss, because the first card you pull will be a partial failure every single time, but at least you're not dead yet. It's a very interesting way to create a horror dynamic where you are almost excited for the next failure, because at least you're not going to be dead. It's not going to get you to your goal, but you can at least keep telling the story. And it's a really great way to play with new players and teach them that failure isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be part of the fun. 10 Candles by Stephen Dewey focuses on the darkness creeping in a post-apocalyptic world where monsters hide in the darkness. You are going to die eventually, but you're building community in the meantime while you have 10 candles blowing out one by one. These are physical candles. They are usually tea lights, but can be any candle you choose. And anything that blows them out increases the acceleration of the game. So a wind blows by, the air conditioning kicks on, and it blows out a candle. You can't turn that candle back on. You just moved even faster to your destination. And that's just how the story goes. You are definitely going to die in the end, but in the meantime, you're counting down, watching as you know you're running out of time, and trying to tell as much of a story in the meantime. It is a very ominous game, full of ambiance, and I really wish there was more ways to play this at conventions more often, because fire and conventions don't really go well together, but I do really enjoy having the authentic flame when playing this game. If you're looking for interesting mechanics, you can always turn to Thorny Games. They've produced quite a few at this point, and each one of their games uses unique, interesting, and sometimes a little strange mechanics in order to tell the story of whatever they're trying to do. Their initial one, Sign, focused on Nicaraguan sign language, which, if you don't know the history, they took 50 kids, put them in a room together, and said, figure out how to make a sign language, which became the national sign language. And in the game Sign, you are recreating that experiment. You gather with all of your other players in a room and figure out how to create a sign language. You cannot use words. You can vaguely use grunts, and you will have a way to communicate by the time you're walking out of that room about 2 hours later. That was their first game, and they have continued to iterate on these ideas since. You end up with Dialect, which is the story of how languages develop and how they die. The kindest version of this game I know is a hack focusing on the children's Thanksgiving table, known as the kids' table. And you have the kids gathering together at the beginning of the meal, figuring out how to use common slang, developing language, iterating on that language, developing it over the course of the meal before they separate at the end of the night and don't see each other again for another year. The most recent addition to their game selections is Xenolanguage, which uses a Ouija board-like mechanic in order to create a language communication between you and some aliens. You have some symbols, you don't know what they mean, and by interacting with these symbols, you end up telling a story little by little of what these symbols mean for the alien culture and start to piece together how their language works. Honestly, some of my favorite, most creative designers out there, and I highly recommend everything they produce. So really, if you want to get involved in weird, interesting games, look to Thorny Games. Okay, so we're getting down to the last few, and I will leave you with this one controversy in the gaming community from about 2018-2019, which was about the 200-word RPG competition. In the 200-word RPG competition, you have 200 words to tell an entire story, and then those games compete against each other in order to see which one is the most glorified or the most playable, because 200 words is very hard to get a game. Just Italy decided to change the game a little bit by saying, you're playing yourself, but braver. That's it, that's your entire character. Go into a dark room and scream nice things about yourself. It won an award, and it became highly criticized by quite a few people about not being a game because you don't have a character, you're just playing yourself. She insisted, yes, I am playing a character because I would never say these nice things about myself in any circumstance. So as a result, that sounds like a character to me, and it leaves the idea of what actually defines a game remains to be seen. Everybody has a slightly different opinion. So at this point, we've covered quite a few games in the catalog, and there's definitely a bias towards story games. It's not that there aren't more interesting mechanics in trad games, it just so happens that story games play around with a larger range of mechanics, and as a result, it is easier to pick out games that have unique mechanics. More importantly, it's also really important to remember that every game that is now commonplace started off as a unique mechanic. There was always the first edition of D&D, the first edition of Powered by the Apocalypse World, before everyone started hacking it and developing it to be commonplace. So from that, we can take away a couple of major ideas. One, don't reinvent the wheel. The reason why I'm recommending these games is not to say, look at how unique these are, we should all strive to be something this unique, but instead, let's try to use them because they're not really being seen in other games. There's a lot there and a lot of mechanics we've discussed that really only show up in one game, and why is that so limited when there's so many different possibilities to apply them to? So use them. It's also a reminder to get out there and play new games. You want to play games where you think the mechanics are broken. You might want to play games that you may not like in the first place and get a bunch of friends you're going to have a fun time doing that with, because it's really fun to break games you don't like with your friends. That is part of the experience and really something we should make a greater point of trying to do. I also highly recommend we try making new mechanics just to see if they break. So happens that it might not, and you might have the base of a new system that everybody's been trying to figure out. With that, I'm going to bring this to a conclusion. If you enjoyed this video, give it a hype, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.